Hey, I'm Delise.
And I'm Ginny.
We know that parenting comes in seasons, and even the smallest wins deserve a happy dance.
Join us as we chat with moms in every stage of the parenting journey, fixing our eyes on Jesus each step of the way.
This is Blessings and Motherhood, because we believe that you can hold tissues and confetti at the same time. Hey everyone, welcome back to Blessings and Motherhood. Today we are going to go on a deep dive. We have Jennifer Courtney, who is the Chief Academic Officer here at Classical Conversations, and we're actually going to take you back and talk about the history of education and then also the responsibility of the parent to their children and what that means for us today.
Yeah, so let's dive in, guys. You're not going to want to miss the end of this episode specifically. Well, welcome, Jennifer. We are so excited to have you on Blessings in Motherhood today.
Well, thanks for having me. I love visiting with you guys.
Yeah, this is going to be really fun. So for our listeners who maybe don't know your name, haven't opened up the Copper Lodge book that they have and seen your name in there, tell them who you are to CC, and why we have you here today.
Yeah. So I am Jennifer Courtney. I am the wife of my high school sweetheart. We just celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary. And he works as the chief investment officer of a wealth advisory firm, which actually matters for what I'm going to tell you in a minute. We have 4 children. Our oldest has already graduated not only from Classical Conversations all the way through Challenge 4, but he's also graduated from college, and he works as an investment analyst at my husband's firm. So I have 2 daughters who are in college. They also graduated all the way through Classical Conversations. One of them is in her last year studying graphic design, and the other one is in her second year studying physical therapy. And then I have one left at home, and she is in Challenge 2, and I am her Challenge 2 director this year. So I said it was my 30th wedding anniversary. It's my 20th year in CC community. It is my 8th time to tutor Challenge 2. So I'm having lots of milestones this year, but I've done many, many, many jobs in CC, and I'm currently serving as the Chief Academic Officer, which is just a fancy way of saying that I work with the folks who make our curriculum and translate it and adapt it for all the countries that we have communities in.
Mm-hmm. And you do such a great job at that too. I just had to add that in there. I always love listening to you talk about your love for curriculum, your love for reading, your love for education. And we got to hear you talk a little bit about that the other day and give kind of an educational timeline presentation to some of us people that work at CC. And I thought it was just so well put together, and Delise did too. So we said, we need to have you on here to talk about this. And first, just to tell our listeners, why is the history of education just important to know in general?
Yeah. So I'm going to back way up for a second. The idea of history itself is important because knowing our heritage is what allows us to move into the future and also not let go of the things that are important as we do that. And so I'm grateful because I have a multi-generational family who all lived near me. And so I got to grow up hearing those stories, and that heritage mattered as I carried my own family into the future. And so the same is true for us as home educators. If we say we are pursuing classical Christian education and community, then we need to know what the heritage of that is as we take it into the future and into our own time and place and circumstances.
Mm. That's really good. We have to know where we've been and what we need to hold on to as we continue to go through our journeys. And what I loved about the timeline, it was a very broad brush, which was fun to look at. But I loved that you honed in on some very early events and some very specific events throughout time and honestly throughout the globe. Would you talk our listeners through the beginning of that timeline and really what happened and where classical Christian education comes from?
Yeah. So I wanted to, I'm glad you said it's a broad brush timeline because it absolutely is. I had only a certain amount of space to give to it, but I just wanted to hit the highlights of classical Christian and home education. since those are the things we're pursuing. So I went all the way back to about the 7th century BC, which is when Deuteronomy was written down. And we have that verse that we love to quote, Deuteronomy 6:7, about talking to our children as we rise up and lie down and walk along the road. And so I put my pin on the timeline as that's the moment that home education is ordained. When God tells his people, education happens in your family, and you need to be doing that thing all day and as you're together. And then for classical education, most people would date that to about the 4th century BC with Plato. He founds the first academy. So that's about when we would put that pin on the timeline. And then for Christian education, really, I think the best date is the 1st century AD. Why? Because that is when Jesus was born. He had his 3 years of ministry, which to me is him ushering in classical education. Those 3 years of his ministry are about him taking the past that his disciples already knew from the Old Testament scriptures that they knew and had memorized, and explaining to them what it meant. So that really is the birth of Christian education. And then with his death and resurrection and his disciples going out into the world, that Christian education becomes available to all of us. And then if you look at the period of the Middle Ages, so, shortly after Rome falls, so let's just really broad brush say the Middle Ages lasts from 500 to 1500. That's really when the church is growing. So the disciples have gone out, missionaries have continued to go out. And as the Western church grows, so does classical Christian education. So the monasteries are copying manuscripts and preserving that knowledge, both from scriptures and commentaries and from the classical world. And that's where you go to get an education, is you go to the monastery. So it's a classical Christian education. And that's sort of the highlight, I guess. And then we go downward on the slope a little bit, because what happens after that is that we have the Age of Enlightenment. And again, broad brush, let's say 1650 to 1800. And that really is the rise of secular education, which continues to this present day. So people no longer are viewing education as a way to usher members of the family into Christian living. They're looking at education as a secular endeavor, either for the purpose of the state and making good citizens, or for the purpose of making good workers. And so in the 1800s, you have all these countries forming and becoming nationalist. And as they do that, they have a mission to educate their citizens. So in 1809, we have the first instance of people being made to go to school, of compulsory education. And that happens in the very militaristic state of Prussia, because they want to make good citizens and make a strong state. And so they have compulsory education. So not long after that, around the time of the Civil War, we have Horace Mann in the United States wanting to have compulsory education in America. So he visits the schools in Europe, and his major mission after abolition. So he was a zealous abolitionist, but after that, his major mission was to establish free public education in the United States. And so he started in his home state of Massachusetts, and it spread. And then in 1920, you have John Dewey, who was an educational philosopher. And he said, well, it's not really even making good citizens like those guys in the 19th century thought. We are in the era of making good workers. And so we want to produce people who are good at jobs. And then in the 1940s, Dorothy Sayers, who was a friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, gives a speech about classical education called The Lost Tools of Learning. Most people date that as the date that people start thinking about classical Christian education again. And then in 1980, when the Logos School was founded in Idaho, most people date that as the classical Christian school renewal. And then in 1992, homeschooling became legal in all 50 states of the U.S. So that's kind of the broad brush timeline of Christian, classical education to Christian education to secular education to where we are today with classical Christian homeschooling.
Jennifer, that was awesome. By the way, I love that. And for you guys listening, whether you're listening on YouTube or through Spotify or Apple, wherever you're listening to, we're going to have that timeline here on YouTube channel. So if you're listening somewhere else, come over to our YouTube channel and we're going to have pictures of that timeline for you to be able to have that visual aid. Jennifer, it feels like it must have taken you forever to come up with that. I don't know how you did that, but I want to go back and hit a few of those key things and maybe dig a little deeper into them. And I first wanted to start in Deuteronomy. You went to Deuteronomy 6:7. And what just first brought you to that verse? Or did you consider other verses when home education you felt started? How did you start with there?
So way back in the dark ages, when I started homeschooling my own family, this was a verse that was often quoted whenever I would go to homeschool conferences or just our local homeschool groups. It was a verse that I think home educating families really took to heart, that you should teach God's statutes diligently to your children. And then it was that idea of you're teaching your kids all day long when you're sitting down at the table, when you're walking, or as in our case, driving somewhere. Car schooling is real. And at night when you're talking to them and praying with them, and in the morning when you rise up with them. So it was that, I think that gave people a new vision for, I'm going to be with my family all day, every day. And as we go about and do life together as a family, we will be learning together.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
That's good.
That is good. And I love how God spoke to you through that verse, even at those homeschool conferences. I know we've got that verse up at our house. I'm sure many of you homeschoolers out there do. Even if you don't homeschool, it's just good to be reminded how we're supposed to be discipling our children. What would you maybe say to that person who they don't homeschool? Maybe they feel like they can't homeschool, but they want to put that verse into practice in their life.
Yeah. So just be mindful of spending time with our kids. So I know a lot of us are talking about breaking up with our cell phones.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's a real thing when we're with our children. So if your children aren't with you all day because you're not homeschooling, you still can fulfill this commandment by talking to them in the morning as you're feeding them and getting them ready to go out the door, by praying with them, talking to them when they get home, just being really present with them all the hours that they're in your home, and also just taking them with you everywhere. They're learning so much when you take them to the store or to minister to someone from church that's sick or to take a meal to a family. Just being present with them.
That's so good. So, okay, let's keep drilling down into this idea, because I've noticed in my generation a trend of trying to separate teaching your children about the secular and teaching your children about the sacred. And so I've heard people very recently approach this verse and say, hey, okay, yes, that's still a command, but discipleship requires consent. So if I'm going to teach my children every day, I'm not necessarily focusing on teaching them the things of the Lord while I'm teaching them scholastic topics. How would you respond to that? What do you think they get right, and what do you think they get wrong in that thinking?
I think it's a false dichotomy. One good place for your listeners to go is any of the works of Francis Schaeffer, but particularly his video series, How Shall We Then Live? Because he specifically addresses that a modern attempt to separate our faith from our reason. And he will argue that they should never be separated. On a maybe less philosophical level, what I will say is over the last 20 years, I'm grateful that that divide has been healed in my own life, because that is, of course, how I grew up. Church on Sunday, public school 5 days a week, never the two shall meet. And the thing that has been most resurrected over the last 20 years is that I have realized those things cannot be split. So we're fond of saying that, we learn about God in two ways, his word and his world. And so every time I am working with my own children at home or with students in a challenge seminar, we are learning more about God, even if we're looking at subatomic particles, which we're not really looking at. We're theorizing about, I guess. We can't see them. But if we're investigating subatomic particles, we're still learning about God's word about God's world, and therefore learning about him. And we better respond by falling down in worship and then rising up to serve him. Because if he has that much incredible detail inside the nucleus of an atom, then the natural response is to worship. So that's just a thing that has been healed for me, that all things are under his dominion and therefore we can't separate them.
I love it. And then that just reminds me about CC, how we have God in the middle of all the little different strands and foundations. I love that reminder. All right, so let's go forward in the timeline a little bit. I'm going to talk about the Middle Ages that you talked about, from about 500 to 1500 AD. And you did give a few specific events that happened between them. The church was growing. The monasteries were copying work. How can these events, which if there's any other events, we'd love to hear what other events you were thinking through when you added that in there. How can they help us see how classical Christian education was also growing at that time?
Yeah. So, well, one way that we know is just that the knowledge itself was being preserved. So we had these monks who were incredibly dedicated to just copying books all day long, and they copied both secular and sacred texts. So we couldn't have classical Christian education if they hadn't preserved all of that learning that was in danger of getting lost after the chaos of the fall of the Roman Empire. So they preserved that knowledge for us. And then if you look at one important figure for classical Christian education is Thomas Aquinas, who comes along around 1220s, and he's a monk. And he is similar to this conversation we were just having about faith and reason. He's trying to offer reasonable proofs for the existence of God. And so people are studying all of these texts. He particularly studied Aristotle a lot, but sort of took that idea captive in service of the church. And so that's what you see over and over again through that period, is people taking those classical ideas and taking them captive for the church. So you have, much earlier than Thomas Aquinas, you have Saint Basil saying, well, should we read these old Greek texts or not? And his analogy was, well, it's kind of like when God had the Israelites take all the jewelry and treasures of the Egyptians, and then they used those to make the tabernacle in the wilderness and to worship God. And so he said, we're doing the same thing. We're taking those texts that were good things, and we are making them captive to the service of the Lord. And that was the spirit of that age. So you had a number of figures doing that. And then, like I said, that monastic culture, what really was forming schools for younger people. And then it's also the era when big universities were being formed, like the Sorbonne in Paris, like Oxford and Cambridge in England. And they were classical Christian universities.
Yeah. They were, to begin with, Oxford and Cambridge and all that were classical Christian. Man, that's so interesting to hear. We just got to go over there overseas and see Cambridge, and it's definitely probably different than it looked back then.
A little different now.
Yeah, they're beautiful structures. I don't know if any of our listeners have ever been there, but they're such beautiful. And even to just see all of the political things outside that were going on, it really broke my heart, because it was such beautiful architecture. And knowing now that it was classical Christian and kind of where it went is kind of sad to know. Didn't know that.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to our point at the beginning, right? That it's important to know your history so that you can carry your heritage forward. And as we know from the Israelites in the Old Testament, it doesn't take many generations for you to lose. If you don't make those memorials and you don't hold on to truth, you will lose it.
Absolutely. So you mentioned Horseman and the rise of compulsory education.
Yeah.
I would love for you to paint a clearer picture of that for us, because I think, at least from my perspective, when we hear compulsory education, we feel two ways. Number one, why are you making me? But also, oh, that's normal. It's fine. It's so much a part of our American culture that we don't even really blink when we hear it. We just don't want to be forced to do it. So tell us more about what he was trying to do and how he went about that and why that was problematic at the time.
Yeah. So two things. The first is, let's talk about the free part of the public education. That was his mission, the thing he was zealous about. on the surface, that might sound like a good thing. We'll give a free education to every child in America. That sounds good. Everyone could get on board that bandwagon. Immediately what happens is that moves the responsibility of education out of the family and into the government. And anytime the money moves, so does the authority. So if you look at, the one-room schoolhouses that were across America prior to compulsory education, those were generally very, very local, and they were run by the parents. And if the teacher did not do what the parents wanted them to do, then they were out the door. the parents were right there. It really was the village school, and it was controlled by the families that lived in that village. And of course, when you have massive scale of free education, the parents lose that ownership over their children's education. So you had something that sounded good, but it came with the giant strings attached. And then if you look at the compulsory part, I think it's almost humorous to me because, let me tell a story first, and then I'll circle back to why it's humorous to me. I was reading aloud a semi-biographical work to my kids called The Great Brain Series. If you don't know these books, you must read them aloud to your kids, especially if you have boys. They are hilarious. But they're about a Catholic family that moved into Mormon, Utah in the late 1890s. The dad was running the local paper, and the boys, it's a family of 3 boys, and they get into quite a bit of mischief. The great brain is the one who cooks up all the mischief. But in the book, there's this passing scene almost where they talk about the fact that their school stopped at 8th grade, and the parents got together and decided to create an upper school. And one of the boys in the story is crushed because at the age of 12, he had already planned to take over his dad's barber business. He knew the trade, and he was planning to leave school and go into his trade. Now, to circle back to where we are today, I'm sure that our listeners are hearing lots and lots about the rise of trade schools and the need for trades. So it's almost humorous to me, first of all, that a 12-year-old had his business plan and was ready to go out the door. And then also the fact that we're circling back there now because we realize we've made some wrong turns along the way. So one of the unfortunate things about compulsory education is that our children were suddenly in buildings many, many, many hours a day, and we delayed adulthood. So if you had a culture that was used to going to work at 14 or 16, and now you've said you have to sit in this building till you're 18, we have delayed responsibility and that maturing into adulthood and made sure that childhood lasts longer and made sure that childhood is unnatural. If you think about pretty much any famous scientist that you read about, the reason they became famous is because they had lots and lots of free time to think. And because usually they were exploring something, either they were building something or they were out exploring in the world. And we've just taken all of those experiences, the work, the thinking, the time outdoors, we've taken all of that away from our children. And so those were the unfortunate side effects of the free compulsory education.
Hey everyone, we want to interrupt this show to tell you about the new release of Pride and Prejudice. That's right, Classical Conversations is now releasing a version of Pride and Prejudice by the Copper Lodge Library. I absolutely love this story. Pride and Prejudice is a book that I actually listened to on audio throughout the year. And our version of Pride and Prejudice is special because it includes special annotations and footnotes. It even tells you how to play some of the card games in the book. So this is a required resource for Classical Conversations students, and our edition is absolutely beautiful and needs to be a part of your Challenge Family's mind.
Yeah, guys, Pride and Prejudice, it's a beloved classic novel. The footnotes include word definitions, pronunciations, and even historical context to support lifelong learning. It enables students to deepen their reading and their thinking skills. The wide margins in this book encourage note-taking and having those conversations about the book and even about the author.
So students discuss Pride and Prejudice and its themes together in community while also using it as a basis for writing assignments. You can find out more about our release of Pride and Prejudice at the Copper Lodge Library website, which is copperlodgelibrary.com. Let's get back to the show. Yeah. And we've taken that natural rite of passage, the timeline of that. Because if you're 18 when you feel like you've finally become an adult, then you've had at least 3 or 4 years of frustration where you know that your brain is ready, but they have you in a place where you're not able to take that on for yourself. And so I think that's a lot of the reason why those teenage years, at least in our culture, are often destructive years for a teenager, because they're not able to use what God has given them to be constructive. You do need to explore. You do need that ownership. You do need to go beyond the boundaries of what you've experienced prior.
Right.
And you've got to be able to break out of the mold of childhood in order to effectively do that.
Yeah. And I was really grateful. My husband was better at doing those things intuitively than I was. Especially for our son. I was kind of a girly girl. And so having a firstborn that was a boy was unusual for me. And so when my son was about 14, my husband took him to work and he handed him their weekly investment report in Excel and said, I need you to do this and I'm going to present it. So don't do it wrong. And he gave him a few tips. And so later I said, wow, I don't think it would have occurred to me to hand that over to someone so young. How did it go? And he said, well, he did a better job than most of our college interns because he really wanted to please me. And so he worked hard at it. Or my husband would be doing our floors at home and he would show my son a couple of rows of doing the hardwood floors. Then he would say, okay, I'm going to leave now and enjoy the flooring. So I appreciated that he was helping him move into adulthood and that homeschooling allowed us the freedom to do those things.
Yeah.
I love it. Let's jump forward a little bit on the timeline. You spoke of John Dewey, and maybe a lot of us have heard his name before when it comes to education. And there's a word, and y'all, I'm going to bosh it, but I'm learning utilitarianism.
You did it.
I did it. I know he's known with that word. And then you also went in and talked about how he saw, I might get this wrong, that he was concerned with the type of citizens that were coming up and he wanted to change it over to more what type of workers. Could you go into that a little bit more, maybe explain what utilitarianism is and head on that for me?
So, I mean, I don't have time to go into utilitarianism as a philosophy, but let me just say what it means as a word, because that'll get close to the philosophy. It really is related to just what is useful. And so the value of these young students in a utilitarian education is, what can they do for us? Can they go out and build cars? Or during the space race, could they do enough math to get us into space faster than Russia got into space? But it's all about valuing those young people for their usefulness to society. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, I think we want all of our kids to be useful. And in our home, we talk all the time about how you better go out forth from our house and you better serve people. That is what you must do. No matter where the Lord calls you, you better be useful and serving people. The problem with his philosophy was that was the only value. And so everything was about what is practical and what leads to better production. So if you think about a factory, what leads to better production and is useful to society in making goods. And so then if, there are all these sayings that you imitate the master. So if you have this master that is usefulness and practical knowledge, then your school becomes like a factory. If that's your prevailing metaphor, then you will treat your students like they're on the assembly line too. And so that sort of ushered in the next wave of problems with our schools, is that we took human souls who are all, as you know, as mothers, very unique. And we tried to say, we will treat them all exactly the same, and we will measure them. And we will measure them every year and sometimes every month. And we will treat them as if they were part of a factory production. And so that ushered in kind of the next wave of problems that we're still dealing with in our schools today, is that we value our children not because they are going to produce good things for society. We value them because they are human souls, and we don't treat them like assembly line parts, but we treat them like souls that are to be nurtured. And so we lost that idea of nurturing the souls that are in front of us and bringing them up into the person that they've been called to be, and ushering them into adulthood and into Christian living. So,
yes. Well, and the factory makeup of what he was trying to do, it was not just in the mind, it was actually physically in the
yes,
classroom.
that's right.
And I know that when people who are new to some of this information hear this, you might think, oh, she's being an alarmist, she's exaggerating. She is not. I mean, that is why they moved everything to be in rows. It wasn't just so you don't trip over your kids. It was so that you could go down the row and check it just like a factory. That is why there's the additional of the bell. You know, these kids weren't that far away. They were not any longer coming from across the fields to get to school. So you didn't really need that bell, but you have the bell because that's how it is in the factory. And just all of these other little things to condition them for the life that was planned for them. And so it's an interesting deep dive. I was pretty new to that part of the conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I was shocked when I found some of the things that I looked up. But let's move forward a little bit further and talk about when homeschooling became legal. Because you said it became legal in 1993, correct?
I think, 93, 92, somewhere around there.
93, 92. How did it become illegal?
Yeah, so it is interesting. I don't know that technically speaking it was ever illegal, but it was an interesting outgrowth of the compulsory education. So when you have compulsory education, there has to be enforcement. When we teach our students about to do public policy debate, for example, they have to think about, okay, you're making a new policy, who's going to enforce it? And that's part of the debate that they write. So when you have compulsory education, someone has to enforce the children being in the seats. You can't force them to learn, but you can force their bodies to be in the seats in the rows with the bell ringing. And so that's really when there were truancy officers that were empowered by school districts to go and check on children who were not in their seats in the schools. So it wasn't so much laws as it was an enforcement of the compulsory education policy, in other words. So then parents in the 1980s, when they started to see where things were going in education and how particularly Christian parents saw that their children were being indoctrinated in ways they didn't appreciate, they began to just remove their children from the schools. And because of the long history now that you had, about 100 years of compulsory education, that raised some eyebrows. And so that's when the Homeschool Legal Defense Association was formed, and their lawyers would go and help families to home educate their children without punishment, and also to get laws on the books in the states. So I'm from Oklahoma, and we already had in our Constitution that you could educate your kids by other means. And so we already had what was considered to be a legal homeschooling clause. So in some states, HSLDA was just reminding people, your Constitution has already made provision for this. You can't go against it. And in other cases, they were actually getting that written into law.
That's very interesting. So it never was really written down that it was illegal. It just was because it was enforced so much. And what would have happened, and because I'm very new to all this, what would have happened if they did see that your child was not in a seat and you were homeschooling them? Were they allowed to take your child from you back then before it became legal?
That did happen in some cases with the homeschooling pioneers. There's a little bit better history of freedom in the United States. And so we haven't been persecuted quite to the extent that our friends around the world have been, particularly in Europe. But yes, they could take your family away from you. They could have Child Protective Services come and investigate and question your children about abuse. There were all kinds of things that could invite these government agencies into your home. And I say invite. I'm trying not the right verb. So we all owe a debt of gratitude to those early families who were willing to take risks. I mean, My friend who was home educated in the 1980s joked that whenever the UPS man rang the doorbell, they dived under the dining room table. I think she was being a little bit of exaggeration, but that was sort of the feeling back then with the pioneers was there's this uncertainty.
Yeah.
People were not used to seeing children out in shops during the day the way they are now. And so there was some fear.
Yeah, it's funny. I still get that today. I bring my kids to the grocery store during the middle of the day all the time. And why aren't your kids in school? And in my mind, I'm like, it's pretty common now. Why are we still asking this question?
Yeah.
But we're still there.
Yeah.
Jennifer, I've been reading lately The Question by Lee, just because my son's about to enter those essential, or he is entering the essential years. So trying to get there. And I read a quote that made me think of this conversation. She quotes C.S. Lewis from his work, That Hideous Strength. And it says that it seems like the purpose of education has become the ability for some to control others. Instead, the classical model teaches young people to control themselves. So after having the conversation we've just kind of had, could you give some examples of people maybe going through that, being controlled by education?
Yeah. So one thing I want to say to your readers first is that C.S. Lewis's book, That Hideous Strength, is actually a fictional version of the thinking that he was doing in the book, The Abolition of Man, which is 3 parts. And in The Abolition of Man, he is talking about how the current culture and education, and by current for him, I mean 1950s, was trying to bring about the post-human era. That's why it's called the abolition of man, that we were trying to take away everything that, and by we, I mean the controllers in society, were trying to take away everything that makes us human, and that we were moving as fast and as we could toward this post-human era. So if you want to read more about that, Abolition of Man is a good place to start. I recommend getting a buddy and finding some podcasts or lectures on it. Is not the easiest book to read. It's very small, but it's not easy. And then That Hideous Strength is sort of him investigating in fictional England how that was happening already in his country. So the novel version might be a little easier to read. So as far as controlling, if we think about going back to our factory metaphor, if you control the children, then you do control the future. So you can argue that all kinds of ways. If you control the educational system, you can probably control the way they vote. You can control that. There are all kinds of controls that you can put on if you capture the hearts of the young when they're young and you capture their minds. And so one of the things that I think we try really hard to do as classical Christian home educators is to say, look, when you're, say, 12 to 14, we are going to start to really teach you to notice the errors in other people's thinking so that you don't get taken captive by someone else's false reasoning. We want you to be able to recognize those errors, recognize the truth, love the truth, and then by the time you're 18, share that truth with others. And so, that's so giving children over to other authorities when they're young is daunting for all of us as parents because, whoever has that influence can definitely control their thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I love what you just said about teaching them to love the truth. It's not just indoctrination can actually be a beautiful thing. And it's not just about control. You're not trying to control them. You're trying to teach them to think. You are trying to teach them to have self-control. And that's the fruit of the Spirit.
Right.
And how do you get it? By knowing the God of the universe who causes you to control yourself and to teach yourself to love good things and to do good things with your hands and with your mind. And so I love where the focus of education has landed for people who want that for their children. And I'm thinking about our listeners. What would you encourage people to do with the things that you just presented? You just took them through a history from basically the beginning of time. This is where education comes from. This is how God's saying he wants you to educate your children. This is what other people are trying to do to control your kids. Beware. What do we do with this knowledge? If you're homeschooling already, what should they do? If they're not, and they haven't really thought about any of this before, what should they do?
Yeah. So I would say the good news is that was a lot of potentially big and scary ideas. And what you do to counter those big and scary ideas is actually very simple. So every night you pray with your children as you tuck them in. Every night you read them a Bible story. Every morning you get up and you read good stories about heroes in history together. You read the Bible together. You read fairy tales in which the characters made really noble and self-sacrificing choices. You sit in the floor and patiently over and over again sound out phonics until your children can read. In the colonial America, we had the highest literacy rate the world has ever known. Why? Because people wanted their children to be able to read their Bibles for themselves. So the act of teaching your children phonics, it can be a fundamentally religious act. You are teaching them to be able to read God's word. And as you go forward and teach them how to analyze sentences, you are teaching them how to understand what God's word means so that they can close their minds around truth. As you read them those beautiful stories that are all throughout, hopefully, your homeschool curriculum and your family's library, you're teaching them how to love their neighbors well. When you take a meal to your neighbor and you take your children with you and you have them help you prepare the meal, you are ushering them into Christian living. You are modeling for them how to behave. So earlier, I said that we imitate our masters, and that's good. We, as the parents, are the masters that they will imitate until they're old enough to imitate God himself. And so just being with them and modeling is good. And I want to go to something that you said, Delise, about indoctrination. There is a way in which the original meaning of that word can mean ushering your children into doctrine, into Christian doctrine. So indoctrination, we tend to think of as really bad because you're controlling someone, but it can also mean, and did at one time mean, ushering them into the faith. And so if you're in a situation where your kids are in school, you have to be just conscientious to do those same things. Pray with them, read the Bible with them, take them to church every week, help them to serve their neighbors, and then pray about what the Lord would have you do next. Many of us have often said that one of the reasons that we continue to homeschool is that the Lord called us into it and he hasn't called us out yet. And so, all you can do when you're making a decision is pray and seek wisdom as a family together. So,
Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing this timeline and going deep into the history of education, because it really is important for us all to know at least a little bit about, I think. I'd like to, before we leave, we love to say here, you can throw tissues and confetti at the same time, and we want to throw some confetti with you today. So think about what's going on in your life right now, and what is a confetti moment you just want to shout out to the world?
Well, I am really enjoying right now, as we are recording, my daughter is downstairs with someone from her challenge class working on debate. And this is someone who is new to classical conversation. So she's never done a debate before. And my daughter is getting to share with her what she learned last year. And to me, that is just a precious moment when they get to share something with their community. So that makes me very happy that that's going on. In the same time, and so throwing tissues and confetti at the same time, I'm realizing how little time I have left with my baby. And so there's the tissues and the confetti at the same time.
Yeah. Oh, it's such a journey.
It.
It flies by. Well, this time has also flown by, speaking of which. And I'm sure our listeners have some follow-up questions for you. If they want to reach out to you and find you, or even just thank you for what you shared, where should they go?
Yeah, I am on Facebook. You're welcome to friend me there. And I'm on LinkedIn. So if you want to get some occasional articles about classical Christian education and the history of education and good teaching, then you can follow me there on LinkedIn.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
All right. Thanks, ladies.
Wow, guys, I hope you really enjoyed that conversation with Jennifer. I know I did, and sometimes I need to be reminded of where we've come from and where we're going. But I will say that my favorite thing about the conversation is she actually ended where she started.
Yeah, she took Deuteronomy 6:7 and basically ended up by telling us to pray and read our Bibles and be with our children. And that's the beauty of it, I think, too. And I really appreciate it. So, guys, if you enjoyed this episode, we hope that you give this a like, share it with your friends, subscribe to our YouTube channel. It'd be greatly appreciated, especially you guys that are new that came over here to specifically see that history timeline.
Absolutely. So we can't wait to hear from you. We are at Blessings and Motherhood on all of those platforms, and we will talk to you again soon.